We begin with the controversy over the National Hockey League's so-called original six teams. Well, there is no controversy because there is no original six. Also, it's not a controversy as much as it is just me being difficult about this. Last night here in New York, the Rangers beat the Detroit Red Wings in a 4-3 overtime thriller, but that's not the point. On one American network, one Canadian network, and on one network shown in both countries, this Rangers-Wings thing was billed as an original six showdown. There is no controversy. There is no original six. Still, every network, every team tries to sell this palpable nonsense.
The great game of ice hockey has been thrilling sports fans for nearly a century, and the NHL's original six teams have established the history of this great sport. Get your very own six-pack today and watch the NHL's original six get a history lesson from the powerhouse Anaheim Ducks.
No. Thanks for playing. As your consolation prize, here's a history book. This confusion owes primarily to the answer to this question. What does that phrase mean to you? Doesn't original six mean that when the NHL was created, there were six teams and these are them? Not just not true, but wildly not true. The NHL was formed in 1917 with one purpose: to squeeze out the owner of the Toronto team in the old National Hockey Association. Four NHA franchises jumped to the new NHL: the Ottawa Senators, the Quebec Bulldogs, the Montreal Canadiens, and the Montreal Wanderers. Quebec didn't play for 2 years, largely because of World War I, and to make it even, and to squeeze that Toronto guy even more, the NHL hastily put together another team in Toronto called, cleverly, Toronto. Midway through the first season, the Montreal Wanderers arena burned to the ground, which is a bad sign. So the NHL's opening campaign ended with three teams. So you have your choice. The NHL's actual original six consisted of three teams, or four, or if you want to count the team that did not play, five. Just to muddy this up even further, in 1919, Toronto was either sold to new owners or it folded and was replaced by another Toronto team called the St. Patrick's, later known as the Maple Leafs. Hockey historians still debate this. If the 1919 Toronto team went out of business, the 1920 Toronto team, today's Maple Leafs, is not an original franchise. In the 20s, NHL teams moved and folded and were born and died with startling rapidity. The NHL that today sells the original six did not, in fact, have exactly six teams in it until 1924. And that's when it expanded to Boston and a year later to New York to create the Rangers? No, the New York Americans. The New York Rangers were created in 1926. Not only is one of the original six an expansion franchise, but it is the newer of the two expansion franchises in the same city. The league ballooned to 10 teams. Then when the Depression hit, it shrank to 8. There were teams called the Pittsburgh Pirates, the Montreal Maroons, the St. Louis Eagles, the Philadelphia Quakers. The expansion team in Detroit was at first the Cougars, then the Falcons, then finally the Red Wings. Lastly, in 1938, we're at the original six again. No, we're not. Boston, Chicago, Detroit, Montreal, Toronto, New York Rangers, and the New York Americans, the original seven. In 1941, somebody had the bright idea to call the New York Americans the Brooklyn Americans, even though they were still playing at Madison Square Garden in Manhattan, and the only thing that had changed was their uniforms. They gave up in 1942, and we were left with the teams that did not go bankrupt, which the NHL inexplicably calls the original six. They are, in brief, the Boston Bruins, a 1924 expansion team made up of stragglers who won just 6 games their first year. The Chicago Blackhawks, a 1926 expansion team made up of players purchased from Portland of the Western Hockey League, which had been the Regina Capitals of the Western Canada Hockey League. The Detroit Red Wings, formerly Detroit Falcons, formerly Detroit Cougars, another 1926 expansion team that had been essentially the Victoria Cougars of the Western League. The Montreal Canadiens, without doubt, an original 1917 NHL franchise. The New York Rangers, the second expansion team in New York, and the Toronto Maple Leafs, formerly St. Pat's, who, if you want to be generous, are probably the original Toronto, just Toronto from 1917. Except, of course, the Toronto, just Toronto was just kind of an expansion team anyway. Finally, the original six, consisting of one team, the Montreal Canadiens, and maybe Toronto. What the, quote, original six are, in fact, is the 6 teams that existed before the NHL started its epidemic of expansion in 1967. And by the way, that should have been 7 teams. The NHL was ready to give the Cleveland Barons a franchise in the early 50s. They sold out every night, but the owners in Chicago and Detroit thought a team in Cleveland might eat into their profits. It is this kind of astute marketing that has, in the last 20 years, led the NHL from being just behind the NBA to just ahead of MLS. Maybe. And it's not just the historical revisionism that bothers me. To sell original 6 games and merchandise as if these clubs are somehow better is to dismiss the non-original 24 as newbies, which is particularly damaging given that 24 of the last 34 Stanley Cups have been won by the non-original 24. History's history. Don't mess with it. There is no original 6. The Rangers aren't the original team in New York. The Maple Leafs and Red Wings were known by different names, and none of these teams was even the original American hockey team to play in the Stanley Cup Finals, nor the original one to win the Cup. Those would be the Portland Rosebuds and the Seattle Metropolitans, respectively. The Portland Rosebuds? The Seattle Metropolitans? Yeah, I would need another 7 minutes to explain those teams. They are what some of us hockey mavens call the original 6.